The 2023 draft class came in with a ton of excitement surrounding it, and for the most part, despite the wild expectations it had to live up to, that excitement and hype seems well warranted. Now with that being said, not everyone's lived up to that. In fact, some haven't come close to their expectations. So knowing what we know today, if the draft happened again right now, what would happen? At the very top, we saw the San Antonio Spurs originally go with the consensus, no doubt #1 prospect, 7'4" freak of nature, Victor Wembanyama. Someone that was truly being looked at as a once-in-a-generation talent. Someone as far as to label him the best prospect in NBA history. To add even more pressure to the shoulders of Wembanyama, most weren't just excited for his ability to one day grow into being one of the faces of the league. They were expecting him to come in and dominate immediately. Most of us would fold under that amount of pressure, but somehow he wasn't fazed. In fact, there is no question about it. He exceeded the consensus expectations. Coming into the year, Vegas had his line on his averages at 17 points a game and just over 8 rebounds. Numbers Wembanyama crushed, as he finished the season with averages of over 21 points, 11 rebounds, 4 assists, and nearly 4 blocks. Absurd. His best 20-game stretch of the season came from January to March, where he was averaging 23 points, 10 rebounds, 4 assists, 2 steals, and 4 blocks a game, while shooting 49% from the field and 40% from 3. Obviously not the efficiency we saw all season, but runs like that were more than enough to instill fear into the rest of the league for what's ahead. If it wasn't already obvious, the #1 pick stays the same. Watching the NBA playoffs so far has been a ton of fun, but what's been making it even more exciting than it already is sweating out some entries on today's sponsor, Prize Picks. It's a pick'em platform legal in over 30 US states that's super simple, more or less on different player stats, and you can win up to 100 times your entry. For tonight's game, they've got Jalen Brunson's point square at 37.5. I don't think I've ever seen that. Now it makes sense, he's gotten more in each of his last 5 games. He's in the middle of a 4-game streak, scoring at least 40 points, which is just absurd. But eventually that hot streak is going to come to an end, and I got a feeling that that's tonight. I've got the same logic for my other square, Pascal Siakam, who needs at least 20 points, something he hasn't done in the last 5 games. Those are the squares that I'm confident in tonight, but let me know in the comments below what you're going with. And if you haven't checked out Prize Picks yet, if you click that link in the description and use the promo code JIMMER when you sign up, they will actually match your first deposit all the way up to $100. Thank you Prize Picks for sponsoring. Next on the clock is the Charlotte Hornets, a team that made a relatively polar decision on draft night, deciding to go with 6'9" Alabama wing Brandon Miller. What made this such an unpopular pick at the time wasn't that Brandon Miller wasn't an elite prospect or this was a massive reach, but just solely due to the decision to select him over Scoot Henderson, someone many had in a separate tier in between Victor Wembanyama and the rest of this draft class. But now a year later, most of that crowd that was super critical has been awfully quiet.
Through the air. You gotta be so smooth. You gotta be so smooth.
All signs are pointing to Brandon Miller being the right decision at 2. Like Wemby, he destroyed his preseason expectations. Vegas had his over-under at just 14.3 points per game, but he ended up averaging over 17, 4 rebounds, 2 assists, while shooting 44% from the field and 37% from 3. Those numbers also don't represent the player that he was come the end of this season. Over his last 41 games, exactly half the season, he was averaging over 20 points, shooting 37% from 3 on over 8 attempts a game. He's a dynamic 3-level scorer, knockdown shooter with future star written all over him. If this wasn't a crazy year for rookie production where you've got guys like Chet Holmgren and Victor Wembanyama, what he did this season would be making headlines. So 2 picks in, we've got no change. But here at 3, where we've got the Portland Trailblazers, things start to get interesting. Originally, they went with Scoot Henderson, a selection that many looked at as incredible value, especially for a team that was expected to be hitting the reset button. Since that selection, however, the sentiment surrounding Henderson hasn't been nearly as positive. Now with that said, very few have given up on Scoot reaching his potential. Even less would go as far to suggest he's already a bust. But that doesn't mean there's been much to get excited about so far. He averaged 14 points across the season, while shooting less than 39% from the field and 32% from 3. That is terrible. Of the 154 players with a decently sized role this season, that's the worst field goal percentage in the NBA. Of all the players shooting with similar or higher volume from 3, he had the 7th worst 3-point percentage, the worst of any guard. These struggles also reflected in the team's output. While he was on the court, the team had a negative 13 net rating, the worst of any player that was playing at least 22 minutes a night. There is no way around it. Scoot Henderson was one of the least productive players in the entire league. So, while the potential still hasn't gone anywhere and it's way too early to write him off, with a chance to redo this selection, they end up going elsewhere. Instead, they go with a player that was originally the very next selection, Amen Thompson. Someone who definitely doesn't go without his own concerns, but displayed plenty to get excited about going forward. On the season, he averaged 10 points, 7 rebounds, and 3 assists, while shooting 54% from the field. Nothing absurd, but as the season went on, a lot changed for Amen. For the first half of the year, he had a pretty limited role and missed nearly 20 games with injury. It really wasn't until Sengun went down that Amen really looked like that player the Rockets were so excited to bring in with the 4th overall pick. Despite losing their top offensive producer up until that point, the Rockets would end up going on a tear to end the season. Over a 14-game stretch, they went 13-1. At the time, we saw a lot of the credit, a lot of the attention going the way of Jalen Green, rightfully so. He was playing out of his mind. But because of those insane scoring performances he was putting up, some of the other performances at the time were being overlooked, including Amen Thompson. He was vital to their success at that time. While he'd come into the draft at the point guard position, we were getting the chance to see his versatility on full display. Once he was inserted into the starting lineup, he was out on the wing, whereas elite size allowed them to not sacrifice anything defensively, and because they had gone from a pretty unimpressive athlete in Sengun, who was also the team's primary playmaker, to a hyper-athletic point guard playing the point forward role, he was able to crank up the Rockets' pace and dominate in transition. Over that stretch, he was averaging 14 points, 8 rebounds, including over 3 offensive rebounds a game, and 3 assists, while shooting 59% from the field. Amen is quickly proving himself as one of the most positionally versatile players in the entire league right now. Switching this selection, the Blazers really aren't sacrificing much upside, while simultaneously giving them a lot more options with how to approach this roster going forward. Now again, there is still a major concern with Amen. While there is so much to be excited about with this game, it is completely justified to question his true ceiling with where his jump shot is today. In the present, it's pretty much non-existent. He barely attempts them right now, and when he does, they're going in at just a 14% clip. His form also doesn't give you much confidence this is going to change in the immediate future. There's definitely more polished options here at 3 for the Blazers, but that's not the route they decided to go at this stage in their rebuild. At 4 is the Houston Rockets, a team that's obviously going to be making a different selection as the player they originally selected is already off the board. Luckily though, after seeing so much promise with Amen at the end of the year, they're able to select someone with a very similar skill set. In fact, someone that is nearly identical. His twin brother, Ausar Thompson, someone who originally went with the 5th overall pick to Detroit. Right now, very little separates the positives and the concerns for the two brothers. But between the two, Amen does project to be able to manage much more volume as a scorer, while it looks like Ausar has a chance to be a Defensive Player of the Year level defender at some point in his career. Now the main concern for the two is definitely the exact same. They both can't shoot the ball. This season, on extremely low volume, Ausar shot just 19% from 3. Obviously not what you're hoping for, and it will have to improve in order for him to hold on to his place this high in the draft. But the potential right now is just too much for the Rockets to pass on. Detroit at 5 is where things get really interesting. They could grab the upside of the falling Scoot Henderson. They could take a lot of immediate value with guys like Jaime Jaquez Jr. and Brandon Podziemski. A strong case can be made for a guy like GG Jackson, who originally went in the 2nd round. However, ultimately, they actually decided to go with someone that many originally expected them to take here, but in what was easily the most surprising turn of events on draft night, fell all the way to the 20th pick. Villanova 6'7" forward Cam Whitmore. Someone that pretty much immediately made the rest of the NBA regret letting him fall that far. At the time he was selected, he was only 18 years old, but just 2 weeks later, he was taking home Summer League MVP. He led Houston to the title game while averaging 18 points, 5 rebounds, and nearly 3 steals. Over the course of this past regular season, he was once again showing how ridiculous his draft fall was. He finished the year averaging 12 points and 4 rebounds, shooting 45% from the field and 36% from 3. Production that also needs more context. He had an up and down role all season. Adjusted per 36, he was averaging 24 a game, the second highest per 36 average of this rookie class, only trailing Victor Wembanyama. Whitmore's come out of the gate more polished than pretty much anyone expected, even when he was being projected as a top 5 selection in the draft. Because of where his shot creation and scoring beyond the perimeter is right now, he has forced us to reevaluate his long-term potential. The Magic at 6 are a pretty interesting spot, as it was our first team that managed to make the postseason. They improved their win total by 13 wins compared to the season prior. An incredible jump, but also one that had very little to do, well, really nothing to do with their decisions from last year's draft, despite having 2 lottery selections. Originally at 6, they selected Arkansas point guard Anthony Black, someone that had incredible size for the position, had great ability and instincts both as a playmaker and defender. There were, however, some serious questions about his scoring, questions that haven't gone anywhere. Despite a solid role throughout the season, playing 17 minutes a night, he averaged less than 5 points and 1 assist. He shot with really solid efficiency of 47% from the field and 39% from 3, but that's a little deceiving, especially the 3-point efficiency. That was on extremely low volume, just around an attempt a game. There's just as much to take away from that as there is to take away from his 61% at the line. Now, to be clear, Anthony Black still had a pretty solid rookie year, all things considered. He still has a chance to bring a ton of value in the league. But while that might be the case, the fit in Orlando is not great. The glaring struggle for this team right now is their complete lack of shooting up and down the lineup. They were towards the bottom of the league in both 3-point efficiency and volume this season. Once we got to the postseason, it only got worse. Over their 7-game series with Cleveland, they shot just 30% from distance. The series was capped off by the team going just 3 for 15 from 3 in the second half of Game 7. So here at 6, with a chance to remake this selection, while there's definitely a lot of routes they could go, they decide to grab someone that brings a lot of the same positives that Anthony Black brings to the table, while simultaneously bringing them a lot more offense. The original 19th pick to the Warriors, Brandon Podziemski. On the season, Pods averaged 9 points, 6 rebounds, and 4 assists, while shooting 45% from the field and 38% from 3. Now, the Magic could have gotten more upside here, but for a team looking to continue ascending up the Eastern Conference as soon as possible, they grab someone whose impact can be felt immediately. Someone whose confidence and grit also makes them the perfect fit with this group, especially alongside a guy like Jalen Suggs in the backcourt. We see a pretty similar scenario for the Pacers at 7. Originally, they made a trade with the Washington Wizards to go down one spot where they selected Houston forward Jarace Walker. This time, neither of those things are happening. Now, Jarace Walker is still a really promising young player in the league. Just go watch what he did in the G League. But outside of the G League, we just didn't get to see much from him this season. Shortly after he was selected, the Pacers brought in Obi Toppin. Then when it became clear the Pacers had legit playoff hopes, they jumped on the chance to trade for All-Star forward Pascal Siakam, a move that only made it tougher for Walker to find a role with this team. So knowing what we know today, they decide to go with someone they know can bring immediate value, Jaime Jaquez Jr., originally the 18th overall pick to the Miami Heat. Jaquez was the early favorite to be the steal of this draft. If we had done a redraft earlier in the year, it wouldn't have been unreasonable to have him come off the board inside the top 5. It only took him a few games to really ramp up his role, and he eventually would go on a 32-game stretch where he averaged 16 points, 4 rebounds, and 3 assists, shooting with incredible splits, 52% from the field and 38% from 3. He wasn't looking like a rookie. He brought versatility on both ends and shocked a lot of people with how polished his scoring was. He was showing off a skill set at all 3 levels and even back to the basket. Things, however, didn't go quite as well over the second half of the season, where he averaged just 10 points. But it should definitely be mentioned, and it's probably not a coincidence, that in the middle of those 2 stretches was a 5-game absence dealing with a groin strain. While Jaquez is one of the oldest players in this class and likely doesn't have an absurd ceiling to his game, very few rookies from this class are as safe as he is to project in the short term. So because of where the Pacers are right now as a franchise, they grab someone whose value exceeds his contract from day 1. Then we've got the Washington Wizards at 8, a team that likely has the longest path in the NBA out of their current rebuild. The original selection here was Bilal Coulibaly, someone I'm a huge believer in long term. He's got a crazy physical profile, a super bright future defensively, and a level of coordination that gives me a lot of confidence about where his offensive game will be one day. I liked the pick then, and I still like it today. But while that is the case, there's now some options here that weren't there before. They shoot for upside and take the falling Scoot Henderson, with the hopes that he can get back on track to being that player that many suggested would be the #1 pick more years than not. Right now, Washington should be taking calculated swings for the fences, so that's exactly what they do here. Now, if things don't turn around in a big way for Scoot soon, man, would the duo of him and Jordan Poole be something to witness. Then the 9th overall pick, where we originally saw the Utah Jazz go with UCF power forward Taylor Hendricks, someone that at the time looked like one of the safest prospects in the class. A decision that made a lot of sense with Utah ahead of schedule in their rebuild and still having a ton of future draft capital coming their way. Now Hendricks had a fine rookie season. He didn't play much to begin the year, but that changed as the season went on. Over the final 9 games, he was averaging 9 points and 6 rebounds as a 42% 3-point shooter. It still looks like a fine selection, but with everything we know today, they just can't pass on the chance to get GG Jackson, who is somehow still on the board. He could have easily gone much higher than this, but because of that run of teams looking to improve a playoff group, the Jazz end up getting amazing value. At least, it appears that way. GG Jackson was one of the biggest surprises of the season. While he came out of high school 2 years ago as a top recruit and was definitely in the conversation for the 2023 draft, oftentimes mocked as a lottery pick, that wasn't the case by the end of his freshman year at South Carolina, where he had shot just 38% from the field and 32% from 3. Now, despite the clearly disappointing efficiency, there was still some intrigue from scouts. He had an elite frame with clear talent on both ends of the ball. He just needed to put it all together, something he was going to have plenty of time to do. He was the youngest player in this draft class. By the time the NBA season tipped off, he was still only 18 years old. He's younger than most prospects in the 2024 draft. Pretty crazy to consider when you look at the start he's gotten off to. On the year, he averaged 15 points and 4 rebounds, shooting 43% from the field and 36% from 3. Over his final 18 games, he was averaging 25 and 2, a run that was capped off by a 44-point performance against the Denver Nuggets. Now again, it wasn't a super efficient year, but for someone that was deemed such a raw player, with what we've seen from him, especially as a shot creator and as a volume shooter from distance, he is turning a lot of heads. However, when it comes to this redraft, I am a little torn on GG Jackson. There is no question he would go way higher than he originally did. I think a legit case can be made for him to come off the board inside the top 5. But I also think we could be getting a little deceived here. The level of opportunity Jackson had this season is just not available to many rookies. Every year we see performances and statistical outputs that really don't paint the full picture. More often than not, it comes from teams tanking for a top selection in the draft. While that was never the intention for Memphis this year, they were destroyed by injuries. That's not an understatement. They set an NBA record by playing 33 different players this season, another record for 51 different starting lineups, and another record for the most games missed to injury, a whopping 578. That's really what makes GG Jackson such a tough player to place. He was undoubtedly impressive. He had some of the best box score numbers from this class. But that's often a product of opportunity. His efficiency, as mentioned, was up and down. I can't help but think about what some of the other rookies would have done in a situation like his. A guy like Jordan Hawkins, someone we already saw is capable of big scoring performances when the Pelicans were dealing with tons of injuries to open the year. Even a guy like Jarace Walker, someone who, as mentioned, had a lot in his way in order to shell out a big role in Indiana. But when we saw him go down to the G League, absolutely dominated. He was averaging an absurdly efficient 23 points a game. I definitely don't think this situation with GG Jackson is cut and dry. I think it's completely reasonable to have him go much higher with what he's already proven at such a young age. But I also still think it's reasonable to have him go significantly later than this, even behind guys like Jarace Walker or Taylor Hendricks, whose production doesn't stack up, however just a year ago were deemed far superior prospects, but haven't had close to the same level of opportunity as Jackson. Then we've got the Mavericks at 10, a spot that didn't originally make a selection, and said they traded down to 12 with the Oklahoma City Thunder. This time, that's not happening. They stay put, but they still end up taking the same exact player, Dereck Lively, someone that's really been a match made in heaven in Dallas. From day one he got on the court and his impact was felt. Having a pick and roll presence, a lob threat, rim protector, and someone attacking the offensive boards is exactly what Dallas needed. Lively made that so clear they doubled down on that mold, trading for Daniel Gafford at the deadline. Over the course of Lively's rookie season, he averaged 9 points and 7 rebounds, shooting an absurd 75% from the field. Obviously, to some degree, that's just a product of his attempts, which were mostly dump-offs and lobs right at the rim. In fact, he took just 3 shots out of the paint all season. Right now, it's clear that his game is pretty limited offensively, But what makes him such an interesting player from this class is that could be subject to change, at least to some degree. He has ridiculous speed for his size and a solid looking jump shot, something we saw in high school and consistently throughout the pre-draft process. I wouldn't get too optimistic with his struggles at the free throw line, but let's remember, he is an elite talent profile. He came out of high school as the #1 player in the country. While today with the Mavericks, he's really just bought into this rim running role, which is working, I'm still slightly intrigued about where his game could go as his role is expanded. The Orlando Magic are back on the clock at 11, and this is a really tough one. They went Podziemski at 6, but now there's a ton of routes they could go here. Originally, they had gone with Jet Howard. They're not doing that again. They could double down on the backcourt with guys like Cason Wallace or Jordan Hawkins. Additions to the front court like Jarace Walker or Taylor Hendricks would also make sense. But because of the safety that came with the selection of Podziemski early, here I think they go with upside and take Bilal Coulibaly. Then it's the Oklahoma City Thunder at 12, who are completely shocked and relieved that somehow their original selection, Cason Wallace, is still on the board. He could have easily come off the board as high as the Magic at 6, but things broke just right and OKC still gets their guy. Someone who came into the draft being looked at as one of the top perimeter defenders in the class. Someone that while he had showed some promise as a shot creator, there were widespread concerns about the reliability of his shot and raising his volume in any significant way. Pretty funny looking back considering perimeter shooting is where most of his production is coming from right now. He averaged 7 points, 2 rebounds, and 2 assists on the season, while shooting 49% from the field and 42% from 3. Obviously, he doesn't have a huge role in OKC's offense, but he's without a doubt been one of the more positive contributors from this rookie class so far. What's so fascinating about the timeline for Cason Wallace over this past year is just how different his skill set is being used. The combination of Presti and Dagnall has given OKC a special ability to completely ignore everyone's perception of a player. While a year ago, most were just looking at Cason Wallace through the lens of the point guard position, OKC just saw the skill set. And pretty much from the very beginning of this season, he was slotted into a 3-and-D role where he's absolutely thrived. I don't think anyone expected there to be a situation where Wallace ended up shooting over 100 corner threes this year. The Raptors are a really tough one at 13. They originally went with Grady Dick, but a lot's changed since then. Grady had an up and down year. There's a bunch of new options now on the board, and this Toronto team looks a lot different than when they made this pick the first time. They ended up trading away both OG Anunoby and Pascal Siakam, which in the process brought a lot of new faces to the backcourt. Because of that, they decided to go a different route. They decide to address the loss of their 2 forwards and are choosing between 2 guys they didn't get the chance to choose originally, Jarace Walker and Taylor Hendricks. I think it's close, but having the chance to see a little bit more from Hendricks so far ends up being the difference maker. With the final selection of the lottery, we have the New Orleans Pelicans, a team that originally went with the best shooter in the class, Jordan Hawkins, someone who really impressed to open the year when New Orleans was decimated with injuries. But as the team got healthier and healthier, he really struggled to shell out really any role at all by the end of the season. But because he's still being looked at as such a promising piece for this team, the only way they're making a change here is if there's someone they know can step into a role immediately. So with who's on the board, well, arguments can definitely be made for guys like Keontae George, Jarace Walker, Trayce Jackson Davis. They stick with Jordan Hawkins for now.